Hey everyone, welcome back to the first part of lecture. We're talking about redlining, which is a historical practice on housing that really led to segregation to this day and age. I want to break it down for you a little bit. So let's jump in. What happened was right after World War II, the veterans that came back from the war were handed GI Bills, which was funding in order to spend. They wanted them to spend it on housing and invest back in their communities. So they created the Federal Housing Administration to encourage these young men to invest in housing. With that, lots of suburban communities were being built and put together. However, the problem with these suburban communities is that they were creating guidelines of who could live there. And a lot of times this meant they were white only neighborhoods. They actually had strict rules around who could live there and who could not, and they would not sell to people who were not white. Along the same time, real estate agencies also developed sales guidelines that echoed these sentiments that you were not allowed to sell to certain populations in certain neighborhoods. After that, they created the national appraisal system. And part of the appraisal system for how much a house was worth was race. Race was actually a factor in determining if a house was worth more or less. Because it was a factor, they started being able to draw these maps and actually color coding them based on whether they were good neighborhoods or bad neighborhoods to live in, whether they were worth a lot of money in those neighborhoods or not worth a lot of money. And the areas that were deemed not great neighborhoods were what were redlined or red areas. The neighborhoods that were good areas to live in, and based on race and all these other factors and equity in the homes, were colored in green. So we had this different kind of color coded system of how much equity was in the area and how strong of a neighborhood, how positive of a neighborhood it was to live in, with all the minorities existing in red lined areas. From there, what happened is because you had an association with whether or not your house was worth a fair amount depending on what color area you lived in. If you lived in a green area and you were next to a red area, your house would be worth less because of your close proximity to a red lined area. So communities started to build actual physical barriers in between the communities, walls and things of that nature to make a separation to ensure that their housing and their equity stayed high. From there, the solution was to build what we call now ghettos, and urban housing was the first ghettos within the actual cities to accommodate other populations and minorities. They also at this time period looked at renewing older housing, older building structures and replacing them. The problem, however, is they would tear these places down and then not replace them. And so it was misplacing a lot of Blacks and Latinos in urban areas. And then shortly after this, Lyndon B. Johnson came into president. He was the president and he signed the Fair Housing Act in 1968, which took out all of the racially charged language. They were no longer allowed to create race as a factor in appraising systems. However, the damage had already been done. All of these houses already had values assigned to them, and all these neighborhoods had segregated. When integration started to occur and minorities started to move into white-only neighborhoods, what happened is it caused a chain reactions of whites being fearful of losing their equity in their home and moving out of those neighborhoods. So even if it was a high equity neighborhood to begin with, whites very quickly moved out of the area and would sell their houses for less than they were worth, creating a depreciation in the area and making those houses worth less. So even as minorities got access to these areas, whites created a circumstance where the houses became worth less money. And because of this depreciation and how much money or equity was in the area, there was a lack of investment in the area, lack of community resource investment. So less investment in schools, less investment in parks, less investment in being able to have health services, all of those pieces that were impacting being able to get ahead. If we think about what gets us ahead in life, it's education, it's access to resources. So by depreciating these areas, they're not reinvesting in those things, which means minorities are getting less access to all of those benefits. From there, we can see very clearly we have these racial geographic regions of where people live, where there's white neighborhoods, where there's minority neighborhoods. And because of that, we also get generational wealth. Because most Americans are going to pass down their wealth because they invested in their homes. It's going to pass down in their homes. It's a very important feature. So if you were a family that was able to buy in a green lined area, your house is going to be worth more. And that way, when you pass away and you pass that money down, you're also going to be passing more money down. If you're a minority and you were not able to buy in a green lined area and you lived in a red lined area, your house is going to be worth less, even if it's exactly the same size with the same amenities because of where it is located. Therefore, you're passing down less wealth to the next generation. In addition, because you were brought up in a certain neighborhood with less community resources, there's a compounding factor because you don't have access to the same quality of resources. Your educational systems are not going to be as high. You're not going to have the same access to healthcare. So overall, you see this inequity happening based on a policy that was written way back after World War II that's still being impactful today to minorities and marginalized populations because we still have the impacts of generational wealth being handed down. All right, let's talk a little bit about where we live and how that impacts our health, excuse me. Food insecurity varies based on location, so we see a lot higher rates of food insecurity in southern states. Something more we're going to talk about, especially given the situation in our country in the next module. We know that 80-90% of health outcomes are linked to social factors, so including having access to food, smoking, our race, our socioeconomic status, whether or not we live in a safe neighborhood. All of these things are directly linked to our health outcomes, and we can see how that would be directly linked to where we live. And housing, income, education are all in fact important factors on health. So when we think back to that first slide on redlining and how we have lack of access to resources because of lack of investment, we could see how certain neighborhoods would have a harder time or have poorer health outcomes because of that. It's kind of all interrelated. All right, with that, we're going to take a break here. When we come back, we're going to talk about policing. I'll see you then.